So good morning, everyone, and welcome to webinar 5 in the series Introduction to Bridge Assessments. Today we're going to be talking about interpreting engineering reports, importantly for access decision making. So here we are in the series. We're actually on to webinar 5 there. So we've already done the top 4, and obviously we've got a few more to come after this over the coming weeks. If you're joining us for the first time, probably best that you go back and watch these in order, because we do build the content as we go. So that's the series as it looks, and we're providing those videos online through our space, which I'll just show you in a second. Presenters for today, so hopefully you're all familiar with us by now. Todd Willard is my name. I'm the project manager for the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Project, and I'll shortly be introducing Dr. Neil Lake, who will be running most of today's webinar, and he'll talk a little bit more to his role in a slide or two's time. So today, just a quick intro as we've done. As I say, the body of today's webinar is importantly around how we actually make that connection between when we've had a technical assessment undertaken of an asset, how we actually utilise those results in terms of our access decision making processes. So pretty important one for all of you in local government who are doing that road manager role. So hopefully you'll find that useful. At the end, we'll do a bit of a Q&A. What I'll suggest is that if you can just drop your questions into the chat throughout the meeting as we go, and we'll come to all those questions at the end of the session. If you haven't already, if you could please mute your microphone so we don't get any feedback. As I said, as with the other webinars, these sessions are recorded so that they're available afterwards for you to watch, and we'll also be providing those slides as well. And as I said, please watch them in order so that you can see that content build, because there'll be some concepts that we'll refer to here that you may not have heard before, but they've been covered in previous sessions. All right, and just final slide from me. The next one, just quickly in terms of our project content. So we're developing this Road Manager Toolkit, which is importantly a resource kit for all of you out there in this asset assessment space. We're utilising the site that you see there on the right-hand side of the screen. So this is our project website on the Engagement Hub. If you haven't already, jump in and register, and you'll get access to all the information about the project, but also these videos as well. All right, so that about covers me off on the introduction. I'll hand over to Neil. Over to you, Neil.
Yeah, thanks very much, Todd, and welcome again today to the 5th webinar, I guess. And today we're going to look at engineering reports and trying to think a little bit critically about those reports and how those reports, how you can use those reports to help you make access decisions. So what we want to look at today is we want to cover those 3 tiers of assessment, particularly, and then one of the key things of this whole process is really trying to determine what reference vehicles we can use in future tier 1 assessments. And that's something that I'll probably cover several times today, because it's such an important point to have that lens as you're looking through these sorts of information. We'll talk about a bit about superseding assessments, and then starting that journey of being able to critically evaluate methodologies, assumptions, and results. So this is not something that's going to be particularly easy first off, because getting that critical evaluation really will take time, because you have to develop your skills and knowledge around this space before that becomes something that becomes second nature, I guess. So we'll start covering off on those things. And then the last thing that I really want to cover today is a little bit about what to specify in supply contracts for bridge assessment, particularly looking at that sort of tier 2, tier 3 level, because when you go out to market, what you ask for has a big impact on how useful that will be down the track. And so what this whole session today hopefully will do is pull together a lot of the stuff that we've covered in the previous webinars, and then start to touch on those concepts, really highlighting the things that are particularly important so that you'll have a good basis really to start moving and developing your knowledge and skills in this area. Now, it's a little bit difficult to do this workshop in some ways today because, you know, there'll be a lot of generalizations. So what I'd like you to be thinking about here is what the specific principles are that I'm trying to speak about. But if you have any specific questions about particular, you know, situations you have, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll do our best to understand the context and then try and help you out. So yeah, feel free to just put stuff in the chat. I'm just going to turn off my video now so that we don't get any issues with the lag and that sort of thing. And let's get stuck into it. All right, so where do we start? Of course, the first place to start when you have any report is to start looking at the information that has been provided in that report. So the first question that I'd be trying to ask when you have a report in front of you is what tier of assessment has been conducted. This is very important because it gives you a very good guide as to what sort of information you think that you could get out of a report. But it also puts the appropriate lens on that report to make sure that there is sufficient information in that report for what it was intended for. The very most important thing, I think, and I'll come back to this again through this presentation, the first question that you should be asking is whether a level 2 inspection is being considered as part of the assessment. So what that's all about is ensuring that condition has been considered in any of the advice that's been given. And if it hasn't been considered, then it's really vitally important that you get an understanding of the condition of the structure by either going and doing or getting someone else to undertake a level 2 inspection. Really, these level 2 inspections or condition assessments where we're really trying to look at the condition of the structure, but more importantly, identify defects in a structure. We need to understand whether those defects will affect the load carrying capacity. So it's the fundamental building block of asset management, and it's certainly the fundamental building block of access decision making. So you need to make sure that you have current level 2 inspections whenever you're making access decisions. And obviously it's important to have a look at the extent of the reporting. So how much information has been provided, and we'll touch on that as we go through. The second thing that I think would be a good thing to be thinking about when you're starting to review information is determining what your objectives are from looking at that report. So this is just, you know, critical reasoning, critical, you know, decision-making style processes. So, you know, when you're looking at a report, you know, you shouldn't be looking at the report for it to try and tell you what you need to know. You should know what you're trying to find out from that report so that you can identify whether it has it. And that's a process that will take some time to develop your capability and skill in, depending on where you sit at the moment in terms of your knowledge around this particular area. But I would say that's really important. When you open that document, what are you actually trying to achieve, I think is important. I just noticed, I think someone's mic might not be on mute. So if you could just go ahead and just make sure everyone's, make sure your mic is on mute, that would be fantastic. And then, of course, we've got to get into critically reviewing the information, reviewing the methodology, and determining if there is sufficient information about what you're trying to achieve. And we'll get into that in a bit more detail for the various tiers of assessment shortly. And as I said, so one of the key things that I want you to keep coming back to, and I think this is the second time I've said it already, and I'll probably say it 2 or 3 more times, you should always be thinking about these reports. Is there enough information to determine suitable reference vehicles so that you can undertake Tier 1 assessment? This needs to be the fundamental lens that you're always looking at, you know, information from suppliers or, you know, assessments of structures. Is there information that I can use to then use in Tier 1 assessment? That needs to be our fundamental building blocks. And I think that it's important as a local road authority that you think about this in terms of developing your capability to do Tier 1 assessment so that you have a good basis to inform heavy vehicle decision making. If you have to go out to supply everyone to do Tier 1 assessment, it's going to get very, very expensive very, very quickly. And so, developing that in-house capability, I think, is important at a basic level, and that's the tier 1 assessment. Certainly higher tiers of assessment, yeah, I would generally suggest that most situations you would go out to another, to a third-party supplier for that. So yeah, just some ways of thinking about that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about tier 1 assessment. So the key questions that I would be asking if I have a report that is a tier 1 assessment is I'd be asking, what was the reference vehicle used for the comparison that was conducted? That's the key piece of information that I'm looking for in that. If I'm trying to critically assess whether, it's a valid assessment and it's something that I could use and rely on. I'm also interested in were there live load factors and dynamic load allowance factors applied in any of the comparisons undertaken. And so those factors allowed vehicles to be compared to each other that perhaps have, different parameters for those two factors. And if for some reason they've just done a comparison of the vehicle alone with no factors, then a key thing that I would be wanting to be thinking about is, do those factors apply for both of those vehicles, for the reference vehicle that underpins the assessment and the application vehicle, the vehicle that we're trying to assess? And so, there will be situations where those factors would be the same, then the assessment would be valid, but often they're not, and we would need to find a way to take that into consideration. Now, of course, if you have a report on a tier 1 assessment, if that has been done for the purpose of assessing access of particular bridges, particular vehicles, and you have gone to the market and said, oh, I need a tier 1 done on this. Well, that's very different from looking at a report where a tier 1 has been done on a different set of vehicles. And I think it's really important to understand that, if you go to a tier 1, a document that's been produced for tier 1 assessment and you have a different vehicle to what's in those, then you can't easily just go and look at that document and be able to make a decision on your new vehicle, right? Because then what you do is you actually just get into sort of more of a, it's hard, I'm not sure exactly what term to do, but you would be guessing whether a vehicle is similar or not, instead of using the real basis of comparing vehicles, which is a tier 1 assessment. So it's important if you have that tier 1 report, if you've got a new vehicle, what you need to do when you look at that report is find out what the reference vehicle is so that you can pull that out and use it in a tier 1 assessment yourself. Now, I think that's just an important point just to think about when you're looking at a tier 1 assessment report. And so, just covering off on the last point there, which is what I've already said, but, if you have a tier 1 report and you have a new assessment vehicle, you shouldn't really be using that tier 1 report solely to help make access decisions. You should be finding the underpinning reference vehicle and actually doing a proper tier 1 assessment on it. So that's a little bit about tier 1. Some critical thinking points when we're looking at tier 1 assessment reports. And that is like, of course, what is the reference vehicle that's been used, but has there been a percentage of reference vehicle specified, right? Now, if your reference vehicle is a design vehicle, well, then the percentage would be 100%. But if your reference vehicle has come from previous tier 2 or tier 3 assessments, then that reference vehicle should ideally have a percentage of reference vehicle, right? So if they've done a tier 2 and all they've done is said XY vehicle is okay, and they haven't actually specified that percentage of it that's okay. In other words, the rating factor for that vehicle, which is something I covered in previous webinars, then potentially, you could have a vehicle that, has, the structure might have spare capacity. The rating factor might have come out to be, say, 1.25. And so the percentage of reference vehicle would be 125%. So you actually have more capacity than just the vehicle, but I think what we often see in assessments is people just, suppliers may just look at it as a compliance assessment and go, oh, the bridge is okay for that vehicle. And it's important that, ideally whenever we can, we work out, what percentage of vehicles are okay so that we can really maximize access to our networks. We want to be thinking about whether that reference vehicle that's been specified is in lane or is in a straddling lane position. And we want to think about whether the vehicle that we have is in that similar position. What goes along with that is also the track, the ground contact widths of those vehicles. And I've covered that in a fair bit of detail in the other webinars, so I won't go on about it for too long. But suffice to say that potentially mixing and matching in-lane and straddling lane vehicles has the potential to throw up some spurious results. And so there needs to be a lot of caution exercise if we're doing that. And generally, if you're not sure, I'd be encouraging you to think about, using in-lane reference vehicles to compare in-lane application vehicles and straddling lane in the same way, but not really mixing and matching them at this stage. And as I've said before, as we go down the track, hopefully we will develop some better knowledge around particular bridge families and understand how we could mix and match those. We want to see whether the live load factor and the dynamic load allowance was specified for the reference vehicles, and are those factors relevant for the application vehicle that was considered? And of course, and I already discussed, if no factors were used, then is the comparison appropriate? And I think that the last point there is that if the results come back as substandard, or even if they're not substandard, it's important to think about if there are any limitations in the assessment done that may affect the accuracy. And what I'm thinking about particularly there is, was the reference vehicle appropriate for the situation? The key thing that always comes to mind to me is if, say, a bridge was designed for a MS18 load, which is a fairly light load if the span is a bit longer, and we could throw up results with more modern day vehicles in this comparison to show that it's substandard in the peer reaction. But the thing is that then we need to think very critically about, what that peer looks like, and was that reference vehicle ultimately appropriate to be able to make a decision on access. And certainly in the cases where you have blade peers, they can take a lot more load than what the nominal design vehicle might have been. So we need to think pretty carefully about some of those things. We also need to think about whether there was any control measures that could be used to improve access, and whether they've been considered in the report. And importantly, if you are thinking about control measures, is that reference vehicle still suitable in that situation? I think that's important to think about. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about Tier 2 assessment. So in Tier 2 assessments, the focus of a Tier 2 should be on developing reference vehicles that we can use for future Tier 1 assessment. Right? So we shouldn't be just going out and specifying Tier 2 assessments to assess an application vehicle yes or no style answers. Really, the emphasis should be always on trying to produce information that we can use in Tier 1 assessment. So some critical points to think about when you're looking at a Tier 1 assessment is, what criteria they've used to do that. Now, nominally it should be to the Australian standard AS5100. That's what a Tier 2 assessment is. It's a capacity assessment. So we should be looking for things in there that sort of suggest that actual capacity has been calculated in individual members. We should be looking for what lanes have been considered. Ideally, marked lanes is where we would get potentially better outcomes from. And it's also really important to have a good look and see whether they have considered vehicles in adjacent lanes, so multiple presence of vehicles, particularly for in-lane cases. Also, a critical thing that I would be thinking about in here is, when you're reviewing the report, has the same vehicle been used in each of the lanes? If in some circumstances there may have been different vehicles used in other lanes, it doesn't mean that the results are not usable anymore, but it does mean that there are a few things that we need to be a little bit careful of in our access decision making. And I'll just refer you to the previous webinar. I talked about that in a little bit more detail. Now, there can be some exceptions, obviously oversize over mass. If you've got, multi-lane bridges, it doesn't make sense to put two oversize over mass vehicles on a 4-lane bridge, so to speak. So there needs to be some compromise there. So, it would be common to see something a little bit different in those cases. And one of the key things there in the level tier 2 assessment is, was there a rating factor produced? So go look for that rating factor, because that rating factor becomes your percentage of reference vehicle that you can use in future tier 1 assessments. And of course, we need to be looking for those assumptions and factors to be presented in those reports, because then that can give you the basis to do the future work. Now, what I see very, very often in reports where suppliers have done assessments, and this is something that I'm really, hell-bent on trying to change. We see this generic comment, all factors and assumptions to AS 5100. That's the basis of the assessment. And I would contend that that is not reporting assumptions. And in many situations, it really stops us from being able to use that information in tier 1 assessments. Or if we do use it, then we are sort of guessing around some of the actual factors and assumptions that have been used in producing those reference vehicles. And so it's really important that we force our suppliers to responsibly report on the basis of their assessments, because then it'll allow us to use it in the future. So if we think about tier 3, it's really tier 3 should be an extension of tier 2, with the idea that we can do better, capacity assessments of structures so that we can identify more accurately the reference vehicles, so that we can get better estimates of what they are, and hopefully then use that to do better tier 1 assessment. But a tier 3 essentially is used as a catch-all in the industry. It's everything that's not tier 1 and tier 2. And so if someone said to me, oh, we did a tier 3 assessment on this structure, I wouldn't automatically assume that they've done a capacity assessment and assess reference vehicles. And so it's important to understand the basis of that tier 3 assessment. They could have just gone and looked at, cracking in concrete or the strength of the concrete, and there's been no actual, calculations done regarding capacity. So then we don't really have a basis to develop better reference vehicles. So that's just something to think about when we get a tier 3 assessment. And I think one of the key things to be looking for is what we can see sometimes is that a supplier may just put a blanket statement that this bridge is suitable for XYZ vehicle, and there's no basis for the assessment. And I have seen that quite often, actually, in this particular field, and it's something that we need to be wary of. Now, you often see that when there are more unconventional, say, strengthening measures might have been undertaken to improve a structure, and it may be difficult to develop a basis for assessment. And so I'm not saying that that is not then a basis to use that as a reference vehicle down the track, but we do need to think carefully about, whether we can sort of trust that it is actually suitable for that particular vehicle. That's just because someone has signed off on something doesn't mean automatically that it's okay. It doesn't help you if something goes wrong, if it's just on the basis that someone just signed off on their liability. They just use the liability insurance to be able to sign off on a particular vehicle. So it's definitely worth having a good think about that and trying to push suppliers to provide basis for their assessments. So as I discussed a bit earlier, the key thing that we're trying to look at when we're looking at engineering reports is what reference vehicle can be used for Tier 1 assessment. And so obviously the first question is what tier of assessment was the focus of the investigation, and then that gives us a lens to then be trying to work out how we can use this information to develop better reference vehicles. So if it was a Tier 2, then what we're really looking for is the rating factor. That is the percentage of reference vehicle that is okay, and then we can use that percentage reference vehicle in future Tier 1 assessments. You know, if it's a Tier 3, what was the focus of the investigation? Did it improve Tier 2 capacity assessment, or was it just investigating some other aspect of the structure? Because if we can improve the Tier 2 assessment capacity, then again, we can improve the percentage reference vehicle, do better Tier 1 assessment. And importantly with Tier 3, was it just an assessment to say a structure is okay for XYZ vehicle? And again, push them to, to get a better basis for those assessments. But, you know, if you can't go back to your supplier, you've already got the information. These are things that we need to be thinking about when we're moving forward. If a Tier 1 was done, then what was the reference vehicle that was used? And to have a think about whether that reference vehicle is suitable to use as a comparison vehicle to your application vehicle. And the key things to be thinking about there are vehicle length compared to the span. So if there's vast differences in the vehicle length versus the span, then that's something that we need to be thinking about. The ground contact width obviously is also an important point, and then the lateral positioning. Now I've gone all over these in this webinar and previous ones, so I'm not going to go over it again, but those are the things, they're the key things that we need to be thinking about. So if we sum up really what are the most important things to be, to know to do good Tier 1 assessments about our reference vehicles is what are the vehicle axle masses and spacings? And so, there can be, say, vehicles that could be, say, normally designed vehicles that might have been used in an assessment, and they could have variable spacing. It's important that we know what has actually been used in previous assessments in order to do good Tier 1. We need to know what load factors were used. We need to know what DLA, dynamic load allowance, was used. We need to know the lane positioning and multiple presence of vehicles and the factors used for those additional vehicles, and ideally some of the modelling assumptions that we use. So these are all really important points that we need to be thinking about. All right, so now I just want to talk a bit about superseding of assessments. We see often, I guess, road authorities that get a little bit confused with, they have a Tier 1 assessment and they've got a Tier 2 assessment, and they don't know which information that they should use or which information they can trust. And I just wanted to take you a little bit through the process of how that works. So essentially, those Tier 2 assessments, what we're trying to do with those is focus on assessing future reference vehicles for Tier 1 assessment. Now, if you have a Tier 2 assessment, the latest Tier 2 assessment is generally considered, your defining most current assessment. That's the assessment that is the most current. If you have previous Tier 1 assessments that have been done to different reference vehicles than what came up in that Tier 2, then essentially those previous Tier 1 assessments would be superseded potentially, and could be redone with your new reference vehicle. So any upgrade in a Tier 2 assessment really supersedes previous assessments. So if you have a Tier 2 assessment and you have a Tier 1 assessment, what you need to be asking is which one came first. And certainly if the Tier 2 came second, then the Tier 1 assessment potentially is superseded. and so that you would need to use the new Tier 2 information to do your Tier 1 assessments from then on. So, you know, if you have those two pieces of information, then yeah, it's important to think about the order. If it was the other way and you had the Tier 2 done first, and then you have a Tier 1 assessment that was done after, and it uses the reference vehicles from the Tier 2, well then both lots of assessment are valid and they're both current. It's important to understand that when we do undertake Tier 1 assessment, and perhaps we might do Tier 1 assessment with a range of vehicles, it's really important to understand that that Tier 1 assessment doesn't improve the reference vehicle that you're using, right? It's just a Tier 1 comparison. All you're doing is comparing each individual application vehicle to your reference vehicle. So if you have an assessment with, say, 50 vehicles at a Tier 1 level, it doesn't improve your assessment of that structure. All it does is give you comparisons of those 50 vehicles to the reference vehicle, right? If you want to improve assessment, then you have to improve the reference vehicle. And the only way you can do that is with higher orders of assessment, like a Tier 2 or a Tier 3 assessment. Now, whenever you get new applications, I would encourage you strongly to start thinking about looking to find reference vehicles that are suitable and conduct individual Tier 1 assessments on each of those. I would suggest that it's not the best idea to go and look at previous Tier 1s and go, oh, this vehicle looks close enough. I mean, it is a different matter when it is actually very similar and there are only very, very minor differences, and perhaps the assessment ratios are, you know, definitely okay. Well, in those situations, yeah, it makes sense to not waste the time and resources. But where the assessment ratios are a bit closer to unity, and you know, where you have a vehicle that, you know, you're starting to get different spacings or different masses, well, the whole point of Tier 1 assessment is to create very solid, dependable, valid comparisons so that we make sure that we consider axle mass and concentration of mass. And we do that with that basic Tier 1 assessment. And as I've said in previous webinars, there will be a tool, quite a simple tool, that will allow that to happen fairly easily. And so we should be building, you know, that capability to do those simple comparisons. Ultimately, you know, we would like to see that comparison be able to be undertaken in real time in the NHVR portal, so that burden of effort is not required by local road managers. But obviously then, you know, the local road manager still is responsible for setting what that reference vehicle would be. So they still have full control over the access that they're allowing to their networks. It's just they don't have to do that tedious, more tedious Tier 1 assessment. But in the interim, you know, developing an understanding of how this works, I think, is very important industry-wide. Right, so let's talk a little bit about critically evaluating methodologies, assumptions, and results. Now, this is something that will need to evolve over time. And we need to be thinking about how do we develop our understanding, and engaging with the information obviously is an important first point. And one important way that you can sort of help develop your capability is really to think about getting experienced second opinions. In this particular field, it's really important to understand that you can't just go out to a consultant and expect that they're going to know all the nuances of what we've been talking about in these webinars. The whole field of access decision making is relatively new, and the use of Tier 1 assessment is something that has been evolving, particularly over the last 10 years. And so many suppliers are not up to date with a lot of these issues, and they're not up to date with how, you know, how higher order of assessment is used in Tier 1 assessment. So it's important, think about trying to get good second opinions, and think about, you know, really communicating with people who have similar responsibilities in your area. across other local road authorities. Certainly, we are going to be working on developing some community of practice around these sorts of things to sort of help develop a community of learners so that we've got places that we can go. And of course, more training in this area is always a good thing. Importantly, we need to be thinking about making sure that the process parameters and assumptions are accurately recorded. The SLAP or Strategic Local Government Assessment, the Asset Assessment Program templates are a good place to start. I'm going to show you some of those in a moment. It's always important to understand the context of the decision making. So what were the limits in the analysis, the limitations in the original design, considering the limitations of particular reference vehicles. I've already made the example of the MS18 load with blade piers, where perhaps, the pier could take much more load than the nominal design vehicle. That's important to be thinking about in our decision making. Do we have any limitations in drawings? Have we had to make assumptions? And I think it's always important to think about the fact that our loading that we have and also our strengths, they're very what we would call probabilistic in nature. And so what that means is that there isn't an exact load. There's only the chance of loads occurring. So, when we actually do our calculations, what we've done is made some assumptions about how big we think those loads could get. And so when we'll come up with results out of some of these tiers of assessment, realize that an assessment ratio is not an absolute, right? If we get a value that's lower than 1, it just means that we don't have as large a safety margins, right? So these are not failure points. So if an assessment comes back, we don't need to automatically think, oh, it's 0.99. No, you can't have access anymore. The structure's not strong enough. That's not the case. The structure is strong enough, definitely for the vehicle as it's nominated, but it's just that we have margins to allow for the potential for overloads and material defects and all these sorts of things. And we need to realise that a substandard ratio means that we have a lower safety margin. It's not necessarily a cut and dry, that vehicle's not okay. And of course, we always need to be thinking about certainty around load compliance, because that sets up, what sort of load factors that we can use when we are determining, what's a fair safety margin. So it's important, when we do get that substandard result, that we realise it's just one component in the decision-making process. And we always need to be thinking about reviewing the results in light of the current performance of a structure and also historical access decisions. And I think it's important, if you get a substandard ratio, you don't automatically then just shut down access to a route that might have had that access level running for 20 years. We've always got to think about that these are often simplistic ways of analysing and viewing structures. Just because we do a tier 2 assessment doesn't mean that the numbers that we come up with are right. There are so many assumptions in that process, and we can't just automatically assume a substandard result means that we should shut down access. So it's a tricky thing to think about this and how to think about it critically. But again, that second opinion, I think, is very important, and trying to find people that you can rely on to talk about these things, I think, is important. Of course, if you do get substandard results, consider ways of mitigating the risk. Can we do something to reduce the dynamic load allowance? Can we do something to improve the load compliance so that perhaps we could reduce the load factors assumptions that we've used? And of course, can we place vehicles on structures in different places that actually improve the situation? All right, so what should we be specifying in supply contracts for bridge assessment? Now, I'm particularly talking about tier 2 here and tier 3, and I'm really focused on more that capacity assessment here. Here are just a few of the things that I think are important. Obviously, we want to do it to AS 5100 Part 7. Specifying that we're using mark lanes, I think, is an important thing to get good outcomes. And it's important that we specify that associated lanes must be considered. So that's multiple vehicles. And also that, whatever vehicle is being assessed, that we should have the same vehicle in all lanes. I've talked about that issue, particularly in the previous webinar, but that's an important thing to be specifying. The vehicles that will be assessed, they'll become future reference vehicles. So we need to specify vehicles for Tier 2 assessments that make sense. The only thing I think that's important there is that, the vehicle is somewhat representative of the sort of vehicles that you would get. For in-lane vehicles, then that just means vehicles that are, in some way of a similar length. The configuration is not super important from the work that we've previously done with Austroads around that. So yeah, it's not something that we need to get super fussy about, but the length of vehicle compared to length of bridge, I think, is an important one to make sure that we don't get spurious results around peer reactions when we go back and do Tier 1 assessment. It's important to specify a straddling lane vehicle like a heavy load platform if it's relevant to the route. Now, if you understand, how you want to operate these routes and you have no intention of running oversize, overmass that are significantly wide, then perhaps you don't need to do that. But I would suggest probably it's not a big deal to do it at the time. So I would probably suggest, it's a good idea to include those. We don't need so many vehicles in these reference vehicle sets. Through the Strategic Local Government Access Program, Assessment Program, we have specified a lot of vehicles, but up to 20 for these Tier 2 assessments. But I think the reality is we can probably get that down to more like, somewhere between 3 and 5 vehicles. So I think that that's something that we'll be working through in this project, and we'll provide some advice on what we think is a good way to go there. So the outputs, it's very important that you specify in your contract the outputs that you want. You need to make sure that they report all factors, modelling assumptions, the capacities of the members. That's very important because we need to see that they actually have done capacity calculations. What the load action effects are, so that's the moments and the shears and the different load action effects that occur in a structure. Very important that you have the model provided to you so that in the future you could provide that model to someone else who's doing assessment. So what that does is provide a basis to get future assessments done fairly easily, and means that you don't necessarily always have to go back to the same supplier. So that's something I would always be strongly advocating for. And a good way to deal with the outputs is to use templates. And there has been templates developed as part of the Strategic Local Government Asset Assessment Program. And so I'll take you through one of those in just a moment. We are running out of time, so I'll just quickly recap the main points and then I'll show you quickly what that Tier 2 results sheet looks like. So main things. We need to be thinking about what you're trying to achieve from the information in the report. And the key thing that we always want to be looking at is what was, if it was a Tier 2, what was the rating factor? Can we find an appropriate percentage of reference vehicle to use in future Tier 1 assessment? And if we do have that, then making sure that we've got the appropriate factors and assumptions that go along with it, particularly, your live load factors, your dynamic load allowances, and your lane positioning. Important to understand, Tier 2 assessment precedes previous Tier 1 assessments. It's important through this process that we start thinking about building our knowledge and understanding and critical thinking skill. Over time, we're trying to improve the situation for local government so that we can get into a position where, a lot of the more detailed fiddly work is not having to be done by local government. But this will take time, but it's still important that you build your knowledge and skills so that you understand how it all goes together and works. We covered, what we need to specify. I'll go and have a look at the spreadsheet now. And remember, always, we need current level 2 inspections to guide access decision making. You shouldn't be making access decisions without current level 2 inspections. All right, so what I want to do now is just have a little bit of a look, just to finish off, on what a good template might look like for reporting Tier 2 assessment. So this is the template that's been used. What we're intending on doing is developing a slightly reduced version of this template. There are some aspects in this template that have been developed particularly because we're trying to research particular aspects of Tier 1 assessment. So it's a little bit more onerous, but it gives you a good flavour of what I think is appropriate in reporting results. And you can see, there's a lot of general information that's recorded, what design eras, that sort of thing, what the likely design loads have been. We don't always know this information, but it's important to put down what we know. That didn't go where I wanted it to go, because I was somewhere else in the sheet. Now, you can also see here that we also have a section in here to provide some photos of the bridge so we can immediately understand the nature and the structure of the bridge. And then importantly, if there are any defects in that bridge that have been identified from level 2 inspections, we want to see those in this so that we can very quickly understand any implications that it might have on access decision making. If we go back now and we start having a look, then we have the information of who's assessed it. Now we're getting into some of those real details around what has been assumed in the actual modelling, what the concrete strengths were, what the depths of slabs were, whether composite action was considered. All of these sorts of things are the sorts of information that you do want to collect so that if anyone is using this information in the future, they can very quickly understand the basis of assessment. We've got aspects of how the structure's been modelled, what the spacing of those modelling is, and then all the different assumptions that have been used in the assessment. And again, we don't want to see this as being assessed to AS5100 as being the only thing that they talk about here. We really want to get some of the nuance. And I guess a lot of that nuance is really collected down the bottom here, which we're about to get to. Obviously, some comments about condition, some information on potential risk strategies that might be considered, and then they can be assessed down below. And then, of course, some sort of recommendations. Now, what this template was designed to do is be able to provide all the information that you need without, the reports and all that sort of thing. The reports are useful, definitely, to interpret some of this, but the raw information is what is really very important and is covered well. Now, this is what a typical the template would look like for a particular vehicle. You can see in this instance, we've got a 4-axle crane, and as a result being modified by condition and by how much. All this information is really important. You can see here that there's actually a cross section so that we understand exactly where the vehicles have been placed, which can be very important for decision making in the future. Most suppliers won't really want to do this level of detail, but I think that it's important so that we can definitely use this information in the future. You can see live load factors, dynamic load allowances, associated lane factors are all recorded. And then we get into actually recording what the load action effects were and also what the capacity calculation was. And we can get into exactly, what the rating factors are for each of the elements. So we've got the deck and we've got the girders and we've got internal girders, external girders. I've got in here girder distribution factors. We wouldn't include that in a typical template. Some stuff about the substructure. And then finally, what we have here on the left is those key outputs, the bridge capability, percentage of reference vehicle for the superstructure and the substructure. And then you can see here on as we travel a little bit further right, we have, information very specifically on what the vehicle was. So what the axle groups were, what the spacings were, and then what the ground contact widths were. All really important information to put it in context. Now, that's the sort of rigor that I would sort of want to see from information coming out of level 2, because if we have that level of information, we do know that we can always move forward with good tier 1 assessment in the future. So I think that that's going to wrap up today. And so thanks very much for joining us today. We can take some questions now, because I know that I've gone pretty close to over time. Just a quick reminder, of course, that you know, further training is a good idea. Keep an eye on that website. As I've said in most of the other webinars, we are looking to try and further develop the training in this particular space, so keep an eye out there for it. Next webinar will be on Thursday, vehicles and route assessment. So yeah, definitely get along to that and have a look. And I think that this brings to the conclusion my main contributions to the webinars. So I just wanted to say thank you for coming along and listening, and I hope that it's provided some good information for you. So anyway, thanks very much, Todd. We got some questions.
Thanks, Neil. I think we do have a couple in here. So Emily has asked, could you please discuss what differences there are in a tier 1/2 report? We received a tier 1/2 report from the SLGAAP for an older bridge that had some strengthening works performed.
Well, it's a little bit difficult because I really need to look at it to get really good context. I guess that my first question would be, was this part of the pilot or the round 1? I'm assuming it's probably part of the pilot. And in the pilot, tier 1s were done first, and then tier 2s were done second. And what that means effectively is that your tier 1 results should be discarded, and you should just be using the tier 2 assessment results that have come through, and you use them as the basis to do your future tier 1 assessments.
Yep, as you say, Neil, there, because these things are such individual circumstances, you need to look at the detail of each one to actually determine that. So Emily, if you've got further discussion you want to have on that, we're happy to have a look at that with you. And Les, what are the rules in AS 5100 Part 7 for assessing the impacts of multiple vehicles on a structure? I think we covered this in the previous webinar, Neil, where you looked at the associated lane factor.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the rules are basically that you can consider either design lanes or marked lanes, and for each of those lanes, you need to put a vehicle in it, and then for vehicles in subsequent lanes, you reduce the magnitude of that vehicle by a set amount. So 0.8 for the second lane, and then 0.4 for additional lanes. And I would also point out that in AS 5100 Part 7, there is also provision for trailing vehicles as well, which is important for longer structures. And in that case, you know, it says that the trailing vehicle, depending on the speed, needs to be, I don't know, 7 meters or can't remember the exact, maybe 17 meters or something. I can't remember the numbers. But you know, you need to consider those, and when you have those trailing vehicles, it's important to understand that those associated lane factors get applied to those vehicles. So just because it's in the primary lane doesn't mean the whole lane is, you know, 1.0 and then all the vehicles in the secondary lane are 0.8. It's actually per vehicle you apply that associated lane factor. So, you know, if you had, you know, 2 vehicles in one lane and one in the third, then, you know, the primary vehicle would have a factor of 1, and then the next vehicle would have 8, and the third vehicle would have 0.4.
Great, thanks, Neil. There's no other questions on the chat, but I just had a couple that I wanted to raise.
Sure.
Through this project, we've seen a number of reports, and some of the reports suggest in the recommendations load limiting an asset based on the assessment that's been done. I guess you know, and it seems to come up quite a bit, and I know it's something that a lot of councils have on some of their roads where they've got bridges load limited. How does that feed into the process that you've just stepped through? And I guess how should road managers then use that information?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a little bit tricky. It's important to understand that load limits, as they have often been implemented, are a fairly primitive form of restricting load to structures. For instance, if you have a culvert, and you put on a load limit of 42 tons, that load limit is actually quite irrelevant to the culvert, right? Because all that the culvert's ever going to see is one or two axles on that culvert. So in that case, what's more appropriate is actually a single axle load limit, right? And so the issue around the magnitude and concentration of load is actually far more important than the total magnitude of the load. And so I think that it's important as we move forward in this space that we stop thinking about vehicle masses and we start to think more in context of, the structure span and the concentration of mass. I don't have any solutions to that immediately, but what I think it is that, just because you have a load limit on a structure of say 15 tons, it doesn't mean that the total mass of the vehicle has to be limited to 15 tons. And what I would encourage people to do is start trying to understand what the basis of that limitation was and what sort of vehicle it was. And then when you're looking at different vehicles, do those same limitations apply? All those same factors really apply, and is it appropriate? So I think it's really important that you look at it on an individual basis. Certainly when you are using tier 1 assessment, if you have a good solid reference vehicle, then if you get a favorable assessment result, doesn't matter what the mass is, it should be okay. It just comes down to the concentration of mass.
Thanks, Neil. Got another question here from Amir. What about including repair methodology for maintenance purposes in the engineering reports on assets? I think we've got an answer for this one.
Yeah, I mean, it is a good idea to include those within those, tier 2 assessments. What I'm assuming is probably happening with if that was a tier 2 assessment, then they've probably done the tier 2 on a theoretical basis, and then saying if you repair XYZ, then you might get that that capacity or capability out of the structure. There's no problem with including repair methodologies, maintenance recommendations. What becomes really important is that you understand whether the advice given is contingent on those things occurring or not. Because of course, if it is, then you probably need to get that work done before you can use the outcomes of the assessment. Is there anything else that you were thinking about there, Todd?
I'm not sure that was, well, I guess just to make the point that we've done our air assessments, which are really our asset improvement reports, where effectively what we've done is we've identified that the structure is potentially got some form of degradation, and we can specifically, rather than doing a tiered assessment that is compromised because of that, and we don't know what impacts it's going to have, should we be alternatively looking at one of those improvement reports that identifies the work that would need to be done to bring it up to standard?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that the key point there is, critically thinking about where you're at and not wasting your money on, tiers of assessment that there's just no point, undertaking. So I think that's important, and focusing your resources on the stuff that will make a difference.
And it reiterates that point that you've made the whole way through, and that is knowing the condition of the asset and making sure that you've got a current level 2 inspection. So really, really important. We've got Robert here. Can you show a spreadsheet example of partial failure report for a bridge? I don't know if we've got any on hand, but certainly, certainly that's something we could potentially look at in the future, where we've got a mix of results. Which,
I think it's important to understand the context of what exactly you're talking about, Robert. You know, I'm not entirely sure, so if you could just provide a little bit more information, I'm sure we can sort something out there by exactly what you mean by partial failure. So
yeah, so Robert, if you want to send something through, there's a project email address there, roadassetproject@nhvr.gov.au. You can respond on there with what you're seeking, and we can see what we can do to help out. Just quickly, I know we're just about out of time, Neil, but one of the other things, again, what we've seen in the reports in our time in terms of some of the context, I guess, of how some of these assessments are done, we've seen quite a few where the scope of the report might specifically exclude substructure or peer reactions.
yeah.
Now, you know, when we've got a report like that that only looks at part of the asset, so say the deck or the superstructure, how useful are those reports?
Yeah, look, I think what's tricky about that is that if a report specific, and it's already been done, and it specifically excludes the substructure, well then, you know, you as someone trying to use the information then needs to make an assessment on whether the substructure matters or not. And so, you know, you need to be looking at, you know, what sort of makeup the substructure is. Is it blade piers? Are there cantilevers, you know, with narrow headstocks? All these things could really start to influence, you know, the whether or not you can use the results. Now, unfortunately, in that situation, the bird's already flown the coop, so to speak. When you are going out to procure Tier 2 assessment, it's really important that you're very explicit around what you need done. And so, you know, in the documentation around this strategic local government program, what we've done is said, you know, you as a supplier, you can make an assessment of the substructure just in terms of, you know, based on your experience. But what we have said is that they have to stand behind then their results, right? So you could go by experience by inspection, you know, the substructure will be strong enough, the risks are low. But at the end of the day, what we've insisted on is that a supplier doesn't say the substructure hasn't been considered, right? Because that's not useful to us. What we need to know is, can this bridge take this load? And so they need to make some assessment on that. Whether that involves calculations or not is immaterial, but what we need to do is make sure that suppliers are not writing out responsibility for some aspects that really should be considered in an assessment. So it's an important point when you procure information to make sure that you hit on those points, I think.
Yeah, yep, I agree. Just one other quick point. You talked about superseding of assessments. In the case where the condition of an asset has changed, what
Yep.
does that mean in relation to assessments that may have been undertaken in the past?
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing, because if you have degradation in condition that actually affects, you know, the percentage of a reference vehicle that is suitable, then we have a new reference vehicle essentially that we would use in Tier 1 assessment because the percentage of the vehicle that could cross safely would reduce. So yeah, basically that's like, you know, improving your Tier 2 assessment by considering condition. And then when we go back and do Tier 1, we have a different reference vehicle, basically being the same reference vehicle, but with a lower percentage. So yeah, definitely condition supersedes previous assessments. That's why we've always got to keep an eye on condition. And if we do end up with degradation in condition, how much is that affecting previous access decisions that we have made? Because, you can get to a situation where you start thinking, oh, geez, no, now we're in a position where maybe those assessments really, if we did them again now, we wouldn't provide access. Well, we need to do something about the condition of the structure, obviously, in that situation, or move to limit access, provide alternatives, that sort of thing. So that's why it's so important to be doing regular level 2 inspections and incorporating that into your decision-making process around access.
Yep. Excellent. Thanks, Neil. All right. Well, that about wraps it up for today. Thanks everyone for your attendance. And thank you, Neil, for the series of webinars that you've done here. I think this information you've provided is fundamentally important to road managers. So certainly appreciate what you've done in the last 3 or 4 webinars.
Yeah, thanks.
And thanks everyone for your attendance again. Our next webinar, which is webinar 6, which Neil referred to earlier, will be on Thursday. So again, you can jump on and register if you haven't already, and hopefully we'll see you there for that one as well. Great, thanks very much, and have a good day. We'll see you in the next webinar.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.